Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So, this is going to be the second half of the two videos I have going on this concept of go fast imperialism and how Manchukuo, the Japanese jewel in the crown, right, for their empire, altered the shape and manner of Japanese foreign policy and Japanese politics in the interwar period. So, just for context, this map on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, obviously, I'm sure you all know the yellow is China, the red is Mongolia, the light blue, or lighter blue, is Japan and its colonial holdings in Korea, Taiwan, and some other islands in East Asia. The dark blue chunk at the top, if you're not familiar with the region, that is Manchuria. That's what the Japanese more or less conquer during the Manchurian Incident, which we went over in the last video. And this is what eventually turns into the semi-independent state of Manchukuo. So, as far as Japan is concerned, during, specifically World War II, but even in the interwar period after the First World War, one of the great stereotypes of Japan, especially where the military is concerned, is that the military is torn by divisions between the army on the one hand and the navy on the other. Japan is an island nation, so they have some kind of colonial empire in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, on mainland East Asia, and they're primarily doing this to get resources right, rubber, steel, etc. Well, there's not enough for the army and navy, so they're petitioning the government for, the army says we need steel for guns. The navy says we need steel for ships, so how do you work this stuff out? And there's a rivalry between the two branches. And that stereotype, okay, it does very much exist, and it helps define Japanese politics before, during, and after the Manchurian Incident, which was launched on the 18th of September 1931. So between 1890, the, midway point of the Meiji Restoration, or Meiji Revolution, depends how you want to look at it, in 1931, okay, with the start of the Manchurian Incident, the development of a Japanese colonial empire has to factor in multiple different things which were going on in Japan and in international politics. It has to factor in this rivalry between the army and the navy. It has to factor in the wishes of the global community, especially the other imperialist powers. And it has to factor in the increase, okay, of mass popular politics, of this political pressure from the general population of Japan. So each of these pressure groups, the army, the navy, different countries, mass politics in Japan, so even there that gets divided between upper class, middle class, aristocrats, the poor, right? All of these different groups, they have their own policies for Manchuria, and one of the things, okay, that the scholars who study Manchukuo point out is that this area, Manchukuo, this is the jewel in the crown of the Japanese colonial empire for multiple reasons. One is for resources. There's a lot of coal, iron, zinc, other precious metals that they need for, fighting a war, for supplying a military. But it's also the jewel in the crown because this is an area where all of these different political pressure groups, and these eventually involve, socialists, fascists, capitalists, militarists, etc., poor peasant farmers, wealthy people, all these different groups, they set up competing visions and competing versions of empire in different places in Manchukuo to try and show, okay, that they have the best vision for the Japanese empire. Now, because these policies are connected to different political pressure groups, as these political backers rise and fall in Japanese politics, so too do these policies. And between September of 1831, when the Manchurian Incident begins, and December of 1933, when that state really starts coming into being, okay, this idea of compromise politics, which we talked about towards the end of the last video, it totally alters Japanese foreign policy and how they approach their empire. Okay, well, if it totally changed Japanese foreign policy, then we have to ask the question, what was the foreign policy prior to 1931? And basically, if we distill it down to its, bare nuts and bolts, it takes three positions. Position number one, okay, you absolutely have to participate in international diplomacy, in global politics. And that means, to an extent, participating in things the military may or may not approve of, such as international arms limitations agreements, like the Washington Conference, like the London Naval Treaty of 1930, stuff like that. Things which are trying to, digest the experience of World War I and say, okay, this was a horrific mass slaughter of everybody. Now, how do we prevent this from happening? Well, you prevent it from happening through arms limitations treaties. So they're trying to set up agreements to limit the size of navies, how big armies should be, that kind of thing. Position number 2, you have to resolve problems on the mainland, specifically in China. Okay, not through the use of military force, but through diplomatic negotiation and diplomatic agreements. Because this is not only going to keep Japan in line with what the international community wants, but it's also going to maybe get the Chinese in their good graces, because they're not actively killing the Chinese. And position number 3, okay, you have to ensure cooperation with the League of Nations, because that is going to ensure that Japan has no problems when they're trying to build their empire. So after the Manchurian Incident, after September 1931, Japanese foreign policy starts to change, and you start to see the development of this thing, which becomes the Monroe Doctrine for Asia. So the United States has this policy, the Monroe Doctrine. And what the Monroe Doctrine basically states, okay, is that, the United States claims jurisdiction over the Americas. No European nation is to really intervene in the Americas. They're not to set up colonies. They're not to stage coups, etc. This area of the world is under the protection of the United States. Well, Japan says, hey, we're doing the same thing for Asia. So after 1931, the Japanese government, the Japanese state, determines that they have 3 key enemies. The Soviet Union and communism is probably the most, shall we say, scary of them all. The one that is constantly presented as the boogeyman, in part because the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks killed the Romanov dynasty, and some Japanese are terrified that, well, if there's communist revolution in Japan, they're going to kill the imperial family. So there's that. There's the nationalist government of China, okay? And there's the Anglo-American nations, so Britain, the US, Canada. They're rivals for hegemony in the Pacific, more or less. Now, we talked about go-fast imperialism in the last video, this idea that you have to protect the core of the Japanese empire, so you consistently launch, false flag operations and other military adventures to gain more and more territory to set up buffer states. So the map on the left-hand side of the screen, okay, Southeast Asia, yeah, to an extent, some of that could be considered go-fast imperialism, but a lot of that also is, very heavy on the diplomacy, the creation of Japan's economic bloc, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, trying to boost nationalism in countries like Thailand and Burma, now Myanmar, to get them on the side of the Japanese. Really, go-fast imperialism happens in the northeast. So you see Korea, then above that is Manchukuo, and then there's this blob of pinkish red, which kind of extends deep into northeast China. This is, on the one hand, actual official Japanese military campaigns during the Second Sino-Japanese War. But on the other hand, this also represents the undertaking of false flag operations by groups like the Kwantung Army to continually seize more and more territory to build buffer states for the Imperial Japanese core. That is go-fast imperialism. Now, this shift in Japanese foreign policy, okay, from international cooperation to a Monroe Doctrine for Asia represents a distinct watershed in Japanese diplomatic history. But the key thing, okay, is that this happens over a period of 2.5 to 3.5, maybe 4 years, okay? It's not all at once. And this happens over the course of 3 Japanese governmental cabinets, which is gradually what brings the military to power. So they don't seize power in a coup. Although there are coups which were attempted, and we'll talk about a few in this video, but it's a slow, incremental approach. Now, the first of those 3 cabinets, and I talked about this a little bit in the last video, is the cabinet of Wakatsuki Rajiro, who is pictured on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen here. So the Wakatsuki cabinet runs from April 1931, you can see the dates on the screen, to December 1931. So Wakatsuki comes into power initially on the 30th of January 1926. The prime minister at the time, this guy, Keito Takaki, he dies, and Wakatsuki becomes prime minister until the 20th of April 1927. So this is like his first term in office. It establishes him as a prominent figure in Japanese politics, and it starts him on the path of basically, let's call it, non-aggression diplomacy. This effort to really cooperate and to really work with the international community, especially America, especially China, and especially the British, in trying to maintain some kind of a global peace system, some kind of global order, which leads him, to be the chief delegate to the London Naval Conference in 1930, which encourages the reduction of militarism basically across the world, but in Japan specifically. Now, this angers the Army, and this especially angers the Navy, because what the London Naval Conference is trying to do is regulate the tonnage of ships that navies can have to specific ratios based on navies already in existence. So the British, with the gigantic navy, they're going to have the highest ratio. Japan's going to be significantly smaller, and the Navy and other militarists feel that this is a step in the wrong direction. They feel that this is going to threaten the national security of Japan. So he angers the ultra-nationalists and the militarists, most of whom are on the right wing of Japanese politics. In 1931, he becomes elevated to the head of the Minsaito Party, and his second term with the Minsaito Party basically takes control of Japanese domestic politics, which runs from April to December 1931. He gets embroiled in the Manchurian Incident. Now, whether or not Wakatsuki and some other key Japanese politicians knew what was going to happen isn't really clear. There's still something of a debate over this. There were attempts to go investigate the Kwantung Army and figure out all of these rumors that, something was going to happen, and the Kwantung Army basically sends people to, wine and dine with these government representatives, one of whom definitely did know that something was up, but it's still something of a debate among scholars. But the known, quote-unquote facts of the matter is that the Manchurian Incident happened on the 18th of December, 1931. Now, over the next 6, 7, 8 days, definitely by the 26th of December, Wakatsuki gets wind of what's happening. He's aware that what the military is doing in Manchuria is basically illegal. They're basically acting without the sanction of the imperial government. And his advisors tell him, look, this is wrong. They're breaking the law. You have to get these officers in. You have to court-martial them. We have to apologize to China. Maybe we have to, pay them reparations, something. We have to avoid this escalating into something bigger. Well, Wakatsuki gets spooked by what's going on, and he decides to follow the compromise course of action. So he's trying to work with the military, and what he basically comes up with, what his cabinet comes up with, is he tells the Kwantung Army, look, we're going to authorize the Manchurian Incident. We're going to authorize your seizing of territory. Now, in exchange, the heads of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria are going to agree to rein in the so-called young officers. These people which hail from the countryside, usually, not always, but usually, these people are usually in their 20s, early 30s, hence the young officers, right? Now, these guys are not generals. These are usually colonels or majors, so they're upper mid-ranking military officers, and they're very much interested in go-fast imperialism. So the Kwantung Army generals, the bosses of these young officers, they tell Wakatsuki, yeah, if you legalize this, we're going to rein in the young officers, we're going to prevent anything else from really happening. So Wakatsuki's like, yeah, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So he does this compromise with the Kwantung Army. He's not playing hardball with these people at all. It's a little bit of a weak-kneed response. And the idea is that afterwards, the Japanese government is going to try to establish some kind of new treaty with the Chinese, apologize, and hopefully move forward from there. But that doesn't work, and the Kuomintang Army generals appear to have not really cared too much about this, because between October, November, and December of 1931, the Kuomintang Army keeps doing this. They formally take over basically all of Manchuria, and they start moving into other areas of China. Thus, Wakatsuki's policy fails, and the Showa Emperor Hirohito comes to him, and he's like, what the hell is going on? I have all these reports, and Wakatsuki says, Majesty, I'm trying to do the best I can, and then Hirohito looks at him, and he's like, well, clearly what you're doing isn't working. Don't you think that somebody else should be in charge? Don't you think you should resign? So he's basically telling Wakatsuki, yeah, you failed, get the hell out. Wakatsuki has a huge crisis of confidence, and his government falls in December of 1931 due to the Manchurian Incident. So after Wakatsuki, there are two other cabinets. The Inukai cabinet is the first one, and that runs from the 13th of December 1931 to the 5th of May 1932, and it also follows compromise politics. It is equally as ineffective, and the result is that the Kuomintang Army, you can see on the map here, it keeps expanding. The Japanese Empire keeps going into China. Go-fast imperialism keeps occurring in the northeast. So, in November of 1931, roughly 10,000 Japanese troops get on armored trains, and they're heading toward the Chinese city of Jinzhou. Now, the League of Nations gets wind of this, and they tell the Japanese to knock it off. Stop doing this. Well, the Japanese government, because they're playing compromise politics, isn't able to stand up to the military, so the League of Nations says, okay, look, this is going to happen anyway, but you're not going to annex it. We're going to establish Jinzhou as a buffer zone, as a frontier zone between the Chinese state, which is currently tearing itself apart in civil war and revolution, and the Japanese-held territory in Korea and whatever the heck is going on in Manchuria. And the Kuomintang Army says, yeah, that's cool. And then they just ignore it and they occupy the city anyway. And the Inukai government is forced to support the Kuomintang Army in their actions in Jinzhou because it's already happened, and they can't lose face to the military, otherwise they're going to look weak, and potentially their government will fall. But by this point, by the end of 1931, the Kuomintang Army, as we started to go over in the last video, they have been diplomatically isolated in East Asia for long enough, that they don't care anymore, and they're trying to gain greater autonomy to basically govern their territory in the name of the Japanese emperor. And they set as their goal, the formal annexation of Manchuria and the creation of a puppet state in the region, Manchukuo. So, the background to this slide, and I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with it, this is the flag of Manchukuo. So the stripes in the top left-hand corner and the yellow, this is a combination of Imperial Qing colors. So the Qing was the last dynasty to actually rule China, and the flag of the Chinese Republic. And it represents the, shall we say, idealized view of what Manchukuo was supposed to be. So what is that idealized view? Well, in March 1932, Japanese-occupied Manchuria officially becomes reorganized and recognized by the Japanese as the state of Manchukuo, the Empire of the Manchu, the Empire of Manchuria. Now, technically speaking, this was supposed to be a constitutional monarchy headed by the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty to rule China, and that is this guy named Puyi. So he is in charge. This is a quote-unquote Manchu state, which has a significant Han Chinese population, a significant Manchu population, a significant Korean population, a white Russian population, which are Russians that fled the Soviet Union following the Russian Civil War, and a significant Japanese settler population. So there's multiple groups of people here. So the idea with the flag of the Republic of China and the Imperial Qing colors is that the whole thing was set up to be the poster child of Japanese imperialism. This is where the races of the Japanese Empire are going to live in harmony. So it's set up as this grandiose kind of state. But in reality, despite what Puyi thinks, it's dominated by the Kuomintang Army. And it's symbolized, I think, pretty aptly by the fact that Puyi's imperial palace, the place where he, quote-unquote, governs Manchukuo from, right across the street is a prison. So how free is he really? He might have power, yeah, but not really. There's more here than meets the eye. Now, the League of Nations, okay, they tell the Japanese that, look, by doing this, by doing all this military expansion and by not reining in the military, you violated the Kellogg-Briand Pact, this attempt after the First World War to kind of outlaw armed conflict except in matters of defense. To which the Japanese say, well, we are acting in our defense. We're trying to preserve the strength and autonomy of our nation. And this angers the Japanese delegates in the League so much that they actually walk out of the building and they formally leave the League of Nations. And now Japan is like this pariah state. Now, after the Inukai cabinet falls, okay, the last major cabinet which oversees this transition in Japanese foreign policy is the Saito cabinet. So it's headed by a military man, a naval officer, and much like the previous two cabinets, the Saito cabinet's not able to resist military pressure. So on the mainland, as we talked about in the last video, there's a huge battle over power and over the division of resources between the Foreign Ministry and the Army Ministry. With the creation of Manchukuo and the implementation of go-fast imperialism, this is a decisive victory for the Kwantung Army and for the Army Ministry. So, realizing that this basically isn't going to work, the Saito cabinet tries to create what they call a national unity government. And Japan formally enters what they call the period of national emergency. This period when, Japan felt itself to be alone on the international stage, and we have to do what we have to do in the way that we have to do it, because if we don't, the empire is going to break up. The emperor will go away, the government will fall, and Japan may potentially be colonized. So they're trying to conquer China, they're trying to expand into Southeast Asia to counter the United States, and to eventually gather the resources to maybe strike against the communist colossus, to invade the Soviet Union and save the world from communism. Now, following the creation of this national unity government, political parties like the Minsaito and the Seijukai, they basically lose power. So here's the thing with trying to apply Western ideas of like fascism and a failed democratic government, etc. to Japan. There is the rise of militarism, yes, but the parliamentary system, it doesn't go away, not like it does in Nazi Germany. There are still Japanese prime ministers, etc., but now they're filled by military officers. So they're trying to work within the confines of the democratic system, which is set up in Japan. And it gets altered a lot to eventually what becomes called in some of the literature emperor-centered fascism. But the parliamentary structures basically are kept, all right? And in the process of keeping this style of government, but trying to alter it, you get military officers, especially the young officers, colonels, majors, lieutenant colonels, etc., and right-wing extremists and ultra-nationalists attempting coups. Now, why are they attempting coups? Well, they're attempting coups for the following reason. So, this guy in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, this is one of these young officers. This is Lieutenant Colonel Kengoro Hashimoto. So, Kengoro Hashimoto was broadly allied with this faction, this informal organization in Japanese politics and in the Japanese military called the Kodoha faction, the Imperial Way faction. So what do these people want? Well, the Kodoha, they're looking at the state of Japanese politics and things like the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. They're looking at the rise of parliamentary democracy. They see the impact of the Great Depression, etc. And they say, well, all of these things are happening to Japan because Japan is trying to take Western ideas, Western models, and apply them to Japan. Democracy never existed in Japan, so we should not have this. This is a decadent Western style of government. The West has invented fascism. Now, Kengoro Hashimoto is sometimes called a fascist, and the Kodoha faction is sometimes called fascist, because that's the best model that Westerners have to really understand this, unless you're like a specialist in interwar Japanese politics and Japanese intellectual history. But in reality, it's not really fascism because they reject this label, because it's a Western thing. What they want is what they call the Showa Inshin, the Showa restoration. They want to destroy the Japanese government, get rid of all this stuff. They want to destroy the Japanese government, get rid of all this Western interference, and bring the emperor back into the center of the Japanese political system. So you have no more parliament, nothing resembling anything Western. There is only the emperor and the people who follow him. They want the creation of what the historian Piers Brendan calls in his book, The Dark Valley, a Panorama of the 1930s, a khaki shogunate. So, in March of 1931 and in October of 1931, the March incident and then the Imperial Colors incident, Kingoro Hashimoto plans 2 coups with the Sakura Kai. This is his secret society, his ultra-nationalist secret society, the Cherry Blossom Society. And the plan is to use bombs and other weapons to kill key politicians. Doesn't work at all. The plot is found out. Some of the officers are thrown in jail. But Kingoro Hashimoto kind of gets away. Because his thing is like, look, if I stand here as a revolutionary, if I want to do a coup, it's to save Japan. The Cherry Blossom Society, the Sakura Kai, wrap themselves so tightly in the flag that you cannot accuse them of disloyalty. Now, the next spring, in 1932, the same thing happens. Not with Kingoro Hashimoto, but with other young officers of the Army and Navy. They form what's called the Blood Pledge League. And they try to do the same thing. They have multiple assassination plans. Ultimately, the thing is found out. The main groups in the army fail to back this coup, and it fails. But military terrorism, it establishes this environment in Japan where politicians don't want to do anything because they know if they do something, they're going to die. Somebody will come and cut them down with a sword. So, from one point of view, okay, the Manchurian Incident and the rise of militarism in Japan in an effort to save it from what they view as Western decadence, this is a reversion to the late Meiji way of doing things. So in the late Meiji period, the military, the army and the navy had, maybe not all the power, but they had pride of place in the government. If the army or the navy didn't necessarily like what the civilian government was doing, they could bring down those governments. So in the late 1800s, especially in 1882 and especially in 1896, okay, there were political slogans and political policies, political movements, which basically stressed what the Japanese call, and I'm forgetting the Japanese at the moment, but the phrase translates to rich country, powerful or strong is another way of translating it, military. This idea that you want a robust economy and a strong population, okay, and a powerful military to go out and defend the land of the rising sun, okay, from Western imperialism and Western colonialism, because the feeling is, look, if we don't do this, if we aren't aggressive, then eventually what is happening in China is going to happen in Japan. Well, in 1913 and in 1914, the military becomes wrapped up in a couple affairs and a couple scandals, and it leads to the disgrace of several key military people, generals, admirals, etc. And the Japanese population starts playing with these ideas more and more of what are called the popular rights movement, the push toward democracy, and then you have the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. So between 1918 and 1922, the civilian government establishes control over the Japanese military via the Siberian intervention. The Japanese are going into Siberia to try and fight communism, to support the White Russians in the Russian Civil War. And it leads to the establishment of the Taisho democracy, to the establishment of democratic parliamentary control over the military. Now, the military eventually takes back power, and as I hope I've made clear over the past 2 videos, it's not through any drastic action, it's through using the Manchurian Incident as an excuse to get involved in compromise politics. So the key takeaway then is that eventually the enthusiasm for what's going on in Manchuria and war fervor, and this idea that Japan must be protected from the West, and we have to secure our economic and diplomatic and political rights in China, we had to bring stability and security to East Asia to protect it from communism and from the United States and from Great Britain, leads to the political restructuring of the Japanese government and the rise of militarism in Japan. in the interwar period. And this eventually is going to lead Japan down the path which brings it into conflict with the US and the Allies in the Second World War. So guys, these two videos have been the Manchurian Incident in a nutshell, and we'll talk more about it in other videos. But for now, I hope you enjoyed the past two videos. So, take care. Thanks for watching. If you have questions, leave me a comment, and I would highly recommend you read the bibliography I'm going to post. That's it for now. I will see you all next time.